How did humans go from living in tiny scattered communities, to building cities, pyramids, armies, trade networks, and empires powerful enough to dominate entire regions? And here is the stranger part. None of it happened overnight. There was no single inventor of civilization. No king suddenly woke up and created a city. Instead, over thousands of years, one breakthrough created another. Farming created surplus. Surplus created specialization. Specialization created cities. Cities created governments. Governments created armies. Armies created kingdoms. Kingdoms created empires. And eventually, those empires connected huge parts of the ancient world through war, trade, diplomacy, religion, and ideas. But every civilization faced the same dangerous question. How do you become powerful without becoming too complicated to survive? Because some civilizations built monuments that still stand today. Others disappeared so completely that we could not even read their writing. Some rulers controlled millions. Others lost everything in a single generation. And by the end of this story, we will reach an uncomfortable possibility. The very things that make civilizations powerful may also be the things that eventually destroy them. So to understand how the modern world became possible, we have to go back to a time before cities existed at all. For most of human history, there were no capitals. No borders drawn on maps. No tax collectors. No permanent armies. Human communities were generally much smaller. People hunted animals, gathered plants, fished rivers and coastlines, and adapted to whatever environment surrounded them. Then, beginning thousands of years ago in different parts of the world, some communities started deliberately cultivating plants and domesticating animals. That sounds ordinary today. But it changed human history. A successful farming community could remain in one place. And more importantly, it could sometimes produce more food than everyone immediately needed. That extra food, surplus, changed everything. Because if 10 people can produce enough food for 20, not everyone has to be a farmer. Someone can make tools. Someone can build houses. Someone can become a trader. Someone can organize religious ceremonies. Someone can keep records. And someone can eventually decide that all of these people should obey him. That is where civilization becomes interesting. Because civilization is not simply a lot of people living together. It is what happens when society becomes too complicated for everyone to know everyone else personally. Rules become necessary. Storage becomes necessary. Administration becomes necessary. And eventually, power becomes necessary. One of the earliest places where this transformation became dramatic was Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. By the 4th millennium BC, settlements such as Uruk had grown into something extraordinary. Imagine approaching Uruk. From a distance, you see walls. Temples rise above the surrounding land. Inside are thousands of people. Farmers bring grain. Potters manufacture vessels. Merchants exchange goods. Religious officials control temple estates. Workers build monumental structures. This is no longer a village. It is a city. But a city creates a problem. Imagine trying to remember thousands of transactions. How much grain entered a storehouse? Who delivered it? Who owes labor? How many animals belong to a temple? Human memory is not enough. And that pressure helped produce one of the most important inventions in history. Writing. Early Mesopotamian writing was deeply connected to administration. Symbols represented goods and numbers. But over time, cuneiform became capable of recording far more. Contracts. Letters. Royal decrees. Prayers. Myths. Stories. And suddenly humanity had gained something revolutionary. Memory outside the human brain. A ruler could speak to people he had never met. A merchant could prove what had been agreed. A law could survive the king who issued it. A story could outlive the storyteller. And once knowledge could be recorded, civilization could begin stacking one generation's ideas on top of another. But writing did not make human beings peaceful. Quite the opposite. Mesopotamia became a world of competing city-states. Uruk, Lagash, Kish. Each controlled land. Each needed water. Each wanted trade. Each had rulers. And when resources became contested, war followed. Walls became thicker. Weapons improved. Armies became more organized. Then someone asked a question that would reshape politics forever. Why rule one city, if you can conquer 10? Around the 24th century BC, Sargon of Akkad conquered multiple Sumerian cities and built one of history's earliest major territorial empires. And this changed the scale of power. Now a ruler was no longer governing only people who lived around him. He was commanding distant cities. Different communities. Different traditions. This was the birth of a problem every later empire would face. How do you control people who do not see themselves as part of your world? Mesopotamia had created the city. Now it was creating empire. But farther west, another civilization was developing in a very different environment. Ancient Egypt grew along one extraordinary river. The Nile. The Nile gave Egypt fertile agricultural land running through otherwise harsh desert. By around 3100 BC, Upper and Lower Egypt had been unified into one kingdom. And Egyptian rulers created a political system built not only on military authority, but on religion. The pharaoh was not simply the man who collected taxes. He occupied a sacred position in the order of the universe. Politics and religion were intertwined. And then Egypt built monuments designed to make power look eternal. The pyramids. We often look at the Great Pyramid and ask, how did they physically move all that stone? But there is an even bigger question. How do you organize enough people to do it? Stone has to be quarried, transported, measured, cut. Food has to feed workers. Tools must be manufactured. Work must be scheduled. Administrators must coordinate resources. So a pyramid is not only an engineering achievement. It is evidence of a functioning state. It tells us that thousands of years ago, governments had already learned how to mobilize enormous amounts of labor and resources toward one political objective. And that would become another recurring feature of civilization. Rulers build huge things partly because huge things make rulers look powerful. Temples. Palaces. City walls. Tombs. Later, triumphal arches. Monuments are never only buildings. They are political messages carved into stone. But here is where the story becomes much more surprising. Because while Mesopotamia and Egypt were developing, civilization was also emerging elsewhere. In the Indus Valley, large urban centers such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro flourished by roughly the 3rd millennium BC. Their cities were remarkably organized. Straight streets. Standardized bricks. Drainage systems. Carefully planned neighborhoods. Standardized weights. Trade networks. And yet there is a mystery. Where are the enormous royal palaces? Where are the giant statues announcing one all-powerful king? Where are the long royal inscriptions telling us who conquered whom? We do not have them in the same way we do in Egypt or Mesopotamia. And the Indus script remains undeciphered. So ask yourself. What if one of the world's earliest great civilizations was governed in a way we still do not understand? Maybe kings ruled it. Maybe merchant elites. Maybe religious authorities. Maybe power was distributed differently. We simply do not know. And that matters. Because it destroys one easy assumption. There is no single formula for civilization. Humans can organize complex societies in different ways. Farther east, complex political societies were developing in China. By the time of the Shang dynasty, we see powerful rulers, advanced bronze work, walled centers, chariots, and an early form of Chinese writing. One of the most fascinating sources from Shang China is the oracle bone. Questions were inscribed onto animal bones or turtle shells. Heat was applied. Cracks formed. Specialists interpreted those cracks. The king might ask, will the harvest succeed? Will an enemy attack? Will a royal birth go well? Think about what this tells us. Government. Religion. War. Agriculture. Family. All mixed together. Ancient rulers were not merely trying to control people. They were trying to understand and control uncertainty itself. And by the second millennium BC, civilizations across Eurasia were increasingly connecting. This is where the story changes again. Because civilizations were no longer isolated experiments. They were becoming part of networks. Egyptian rulers exchanged gifts with foreign kings. Mesopotamian states traded across long distances. The Hittites became powerful in Anatolia. Copper and tin moved along trade routes to produce bronze. Luxury goods crossed borders. Diplomatic letters moved between courts. Royal families arranged marriages. By the late Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East contained something that looks surprisingly familiar. An international system. Kings recognized one another. They negotiated. They threatened. They traded. They formed alliances. Then, around 1200 BC, the system began to break. Cities burned. Palaces disappeared. Trade declined. Some states collapsed. Others weakened dramatically. Why? This is still debated. War. Migration. Internal rebellion. Economic disruption. Climate stress. Earthquakes. The mysterious groups often called the Sea Peoples. Probably not one cause. And that itself is important. Because civilizations rarely collapse like a light switch. Usually, several problems arrive at the same time. And the system that once made society powerful suddenly becomes difficult to maintain. Imagine a palace that depends on imported metal. Foreign grain. Long-distance merchants. Tax revenue. Military protection. Now imagine several parts of that system failing at once. The very complexity that made the civilization rich becomes a vulnerability. That is one of the oldest warnings in history. But civilization did not end. New powers emerged. One of the most feared was Assyria. The Assyrians built a military empire that became famous for organization and brutality. Their armies used infantry, cavalry, siege warfare, engineers, roads. They could attack heavily fortified cities. And they understood psychology. Assyrian kings did not always hide violence. They advertised it. Why? Because fear can be cheaper than fighting. If City A resists and is destroyed, City B may surrender before the army arrives. That is empire through reputation. But now consider the other side. What happens when thousands of people obey you only because they fear you? The moment you look weak, everyone has a reason to rebel. And eventually Assyria's enemies united. In 612 BC, Nineveh fell. One of the most powerful military systems of the ancient Near East collapsed. But something even larger was coming. Persia. Under Cyrus the Great and his successors, the Achaemenid Persian Empire expanded across an enormous territory. From Anatolia and Egypt through Mesopotamia and Iran toward Central Asia and the Indus region. The scale was staggering. But Persia's great innovation was not only conquest. It was management. Because the bigger your empire becomes, the less useful one king becomes. He cannot personally collect every tax. He cannot personally suppress every rebellion. He cannot personally inspect every road. So the Persians divided the empire into administrative regions. Governors, often called satraps, managed provinces. Road networks connected major centers. Royal messengers moved orders rapidly. Local customs could often survive. And this was brilliant. Persia understood that you do not always need conquered people to become identical to you. You need them to accept your authority. That is a major difference. Instead of destroying every local culture, empire could sit above those cultures. And under Darius, the system became even more sophisticated. Then came Persepolis. Its reliefs showed representatives from different peoples bringing gifts or tribute. Different clothing. Different identities. One imperial center. Persian power was not saying, "We are all the same." It was saying, "We are different, but all of you answer to the same king." That is a much more advanced political idea than simple conquest. But every strong system creates a weakness. A powerful governor can administer a province. He can also rebel. A long road can carry royal orders. It can also carry invading armies. A wealthy empire attracts merchants. It also attracts conquerors. And eventually, Alexander came. But before Alexander, Persia encountered a much smaller political world that would become disproportionately influential. The Greek city-states. Athens. Sparta. Thebes. Corinth. They fought one another constantly. Yet their world produced remarkable experiments in politics, philosophy, science, theater, mathematics, and art. Athens developed direct democratic institutions, though citizenship was highly limited by modern standards. Sparta organized much of society around warfare. Greek philosophers asked questions that still sound modern. What is justice? What makes a good government? What is knowledge? What is matter? What is the purpose of life? But Greece's political fragmentation also became its weakness. Athens and Sparta destroyed each other's strength during the Peloponnesian War. Then Macedon rose. Philip II transformed Macedonia into a major military power. And his son, Alexander. In 334 BC, Alexander invaded the Persian Empire. Within roughly a decade, he had conquered Persia and moved as far as parts of Central and South Asia. He founded cities. Moved armies thousands of miles. Defeated larger forces. And created one of history's most famous empires before the age of 33. Then he died. And suddenly the biggest question in the world was, who owns Alexander's empire? There was no stable answer. His generals fought. The empire fragmented. And once again, military conquest had moved faster than political succession. But Alexander's empire did not vanish without consequence. Greek language and culture spread into new regions. Greek and local traditions mixed. Cities became intellectual centers. The Hellenistic world created new networks connecting Egypt, the Mediterranean, the Middle East and parts of Asia. And eventually another power absorbed much of it. Rome. Rome's story may be the ultimate ancient example of civilization learning how to survive defeat. Rome expanded through Italy. Then it collided with Carthage. And Carthage had one of history's greatest generals. Hannibal. Hannibal crossed the Alps. He invaded Italy. And at Cannae in 216 BC, he inflicted a catastrophic defeat on Roman forces. Imagine losing tens of thousands of men in one battle. Many states would negotiate peace. Rome did not. Rome raised more armies. It kept fighting. And eventually, Carthage lost. That may be Rome's greatest strength. Not that Rome never lost. Rome could lose terribly. And continue. Then Rome expanded. Spain. Greece. North Africa. Gaul. The Eastern Mediterranean. But military success changed the Republic. Generals became extremely powerful. Wealth from conquest transformed politics. Armies became increasingly loyal to commanders. Civil wars erupted. And eventually, the Republic gave way to imperial rule. Under Augustus and later emperors, Rome became one of the ancient world's great imperial superpowers. Roads connected provinces. Aqueducts supplied cities. Ports moved goods. Law structured society. A professional army guarded frontiers. And citizenship gradually expanded. This was crucial. Rome did something Persia had also understood in another form. An empire becomes more durable when conquered people can become participants in the system. Over time, people from far beyond Italy became Roman citizens. Provincial elites became senators. Some emperors were born outside Italy. Rome had transformed from a city ruling foreigners into a civilization containing multiple peoples. But Rome was not alone. At roughly the same broad period, the Han Empire dominated much of East Asia. And here we reach another extraordinary stage in the evolution of civilization. Two enormous imperial systems now existed at opposite ends of Eurasia. Rome in the west. Han China in the east. Both governed millions. Both maintained roads. Both taxed populations. Both defended long frontiers. Both relied on administrators. Between them stretched Central Asia. And through Central Asia moved merchants. Silk. Horses. Precious metals. Glass. Spices. Ideas. Religions. Technologies. The Silk Roads were not one road. They were a network. A merchant might not travel from China all the way to Rome. Goods could move from trader to trader. City to city. Kingdom to kingdom. And eventually, products could cross enormous distances. This may have been one of ancient history's most important developments. Civilizations were becoming connected enough that something happening in one region could influence people thousands of miles away. Humanity was beginning to build a world system. Not modern globalization. But an ancestor of it. And yet civilization was also flourishing beyond this Eurasian network. Across the ocean, in Mesoamerica, the Olmec created major ceremonial centers and monumental art. Later, the Maya built sophisticated urban civilizations. They developed hieroglyphic writing, complex calendrical systems, advanced mathematics, astronomical observations, monumental architecture, and rival city-states. No Mesopotamian army taught them how. No Egyptian architect arrived with pyramid plans. Complex civilization had emerged independently. In the Andes, societies also developed sophisticated agriculture, monumental construction, and eventually powerful states adapted to extremely difficult terrain. And this may be the single most important insight in the entire story. Civilization is not something one people invented and everyone else copied. Different human societies repeatedly confronted similar problems. And invented their own answers. How do we produce enough food? How do we manage water? How do we record information? Who has authority? How do we defend ourselves? How do we trade? How do we explain the universe? How do we transfer power after a ruler dies? Different civilizations produced different answers. And some answers worked better than others. But now we arrive at the central question. What turns a civilization into a superpower? Not one thing. A huge army is useless if you cannot feed it. Wealth is useless if you cannot collect taxes. Land is useless if messages take too long to travel. Cities are vulnerable if nobody can defend them. A ruler is weak if nobody believes his orders will be enforced. The greatest ancient civilizations became powerful by building systems. Roads. Writing. Laws. Administration. Religion. Trade networks. Military organization. Taxation. Political legitimacy. These invisible systems were more important than any single palace. And then comes the paradox. The larger these systems become, the harder they are to maintain. A massive army protects borders. But it costs enormous amounts of money. Provincial governors make distant rule possible. But governors can become rivals. Trade produces wealth. But dependence on trade can become dangerous. A large royal family secures succession. But it can produce civil war. A road lets your army move faster. It lets enemies move faster too. Civilization solves problems by becoming more complex. And eventually, complexity itself becomes another problem. Rome experienced repeated political crises, civil wars, economic strains, and increasing military pressure. The Western Empire eventually fragmented during the 5th century AD. But Roman civilization did not disappear. Its eastern half survived for centuries. Latin continued shaping languages. Roman law influenced later political systems. Christianity transformed Europe. Roman roads remained. Cities survived. And this brings us to one final correction. We speak about civilizations falling. But civilizations almost never simply vanish. Empires fall. Dynasties end. Capitals burn. Borders disappear. But people remain. Farmers continue planting. Children continue learning languages. Religions survive. Laws are inherited. Conquerors adopt ideas from the conquered. Persia influenced Alexander. Greece influenced Rome. Rome influenced Europe. Chinese dynasties repeatedly fell and were replaced, while Chinese civilization continued. Later cultures in Mesoamerica inherited traditions from earlier ones. History is not a row of civilizations appearing and disappearing. It is more like layers. One civilization builds upon ruins left by another. Sometimes literally. So how did humanity go from the first villages to ancient superpowers? Not through one invention. Through a chain reaction. Agriculture created surplus. Surplus allowed specialization. Specialization created cities. Cities required administration. Administration encouraged writing. Writing strengthened government. Government organized armies. Armies created kingdoms. Kingdoms expanded into empires. Empires built roads. Roads accelerated trade. Trade connected civilizations. And once civilizations became connected, ideas could travel farther than armies. The people who built Uruk could never have imagined imperial Rome. The first Egyptian pyramid builders could never have imagined merchants carrying goods across Eurasia. The earliest scribes pressing marks into wet clay could never have imagined libraries holding thousands of texts. But each civilization added something. Mesopotamia helped transform writing and urban government. Egypt demonstrated extraordinary centralized organization. The Indus cities showed another model of urban planning. China developed political and intellectual traditions that would survive dynasty after dynasty. Persia demonstrated how enormous multicultural territories could be administered. Greece transformed philosophy and political thought. Rome built institutions capable of integrating vast populations. The civilizations of Mesoamerica and the Andes proved that complex societies could arise independently under completely different conditions. None of them created the modern world alone. Together, over thousands of years, they created pieces of it. And maybe that is the real story of civilization. Not the story of kings. Not the story of empires. Not even the story of cities. It is the story of human beings repeatedly asking, how can we organize ourselves better than the people who came before us? Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they failed catastrophically. But even failure left something behind. A road. A law. A language. A religious idea. A mathematical discovery. A ruined city waiting thousands of years for someone to uncover it. And that brings us to one final question. Look around at our world today. Cities containing tens of millions. Instant communication. Global trade. Powerful governments. Massive militaries. Technology ancient rulers could not possibly imagine. We might look back at Rome or Egypt and think, of course they eventually fell. But they probably did not feel that way while standing at the height of their power. Their monuments looked permanent. Their governments looked powerful. Their world felt normal. Exactly as ours does to us. So perhaps the most important question ancient civilizations leave behind is not, why did they disappear? It is this. What are we building today that people thousands of years from now will one day discover in ruins, and what will they think happened to us? Because every civilization believes it is living in the present. Until one day, it becomes history.